All right, we are continuing our study here on the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 9, the whole chapter, verses 1 through 41. And just to recall where we're at in the story, Jesus is currently in Jerusalem. And in the previous episode, he had announced that he was the light of the world and that the one who follows him won't walk in darkness, but that he will have the light of life. And Jesus restates that idea at the beginning of this scene so that we see this healing of a blind man actually illustrates a greater spiritual truth about light and darkness and Jesus and believing in him. And so this story is a story about a blind man being healed that teaches a lesson about true, genuine spiritual eyesight. So let's pick up in John chapter 9, verse 1, and it begins like this. As Jesus passed by somewhere in Jerusalem, we don't know exactly where. So as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who had been blind from birth his whole life. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? And so when Jesus and his disciples see this man, his disciples assume a connection between sin and this man's condition. They assume that somehow he's blind because somebody, either himself or his parents, sinned. And in some ways, this is a pretty natural assumption. It's easy to make. It really is like the entire assumption behind the whole idea of karma in Eastern religions, that there's a connection between our condition in life and our choices in life, our behavior, our sin. And so they make this assumption. There's also some Old Testament texts that seem to suggest a connection between this. And so they make this assumption and they want to explore it with Jesus. Here's how Jesus responds in verse 3. He answered and said, it was neither that this man sinned nor his parents. In other words, Jesus just is straightforward. This man's blindness wasn't the result of any person's sin, neither his nor his parents. And as Jesus goes on in the rest of verse 3, explaining what he's thinking, we're going to have to wrestle a bit with the translation of the next phrase, how it connects and where it connects into Jesus's discussion here. And so Jesus says, neither this man sinned, not his parents, nor him, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And here's the question that we have to wrestle with is, this clause, it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him, does this clause connect with the first half of verse 3, or is it actually the setup for what Jesus says in verse 4? If it connects with the first part of verse 3, then you're going to have to supply some words to it to make it make sense. And that's actually what most translations do. So the translation I read is the New American Standard, and they've supplied the words, it was, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. The NIV adds the words, this happened, but this happened to him so that the works of God might be displayed in him. It's important to know that those words aren't in Greek. They've been supplied. It was, this happened, aren't there. Literally, it just says, but so that the works of God might be displayed in him. Well, that doesn't make sense if we're connecting it to the first half of verse 3. And if you take it that way, then what Jesus is saying is that this man's blindness isn't the result of sin, but it does provide an opportunity to display God's works in him through Jesus. Now, if you take it that way, some scholars have objected, saying it would mean that God caused this man to be blind so that Jesus could work a miracle. But that's not really what it would be saying. It simply means that blindness is part of the fallen world, and this man's condition is an opportunity for God to work through Jesus. But that's not the only way to translate the phrase. Remember, if you're going to translate that way, you have to supply some words. So it actually works very well for this clause to be the start of a new sentence that connects with verse 4. And if you translate it that way, it would read like this, but So that the works of God might be displayed in him, we must carry out the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. One scholar, Gary Burge, actually points out that the Apostle John in his gospel uses this particular construction 11 times. A construction where you have a contrast, but, and a purpose clause, so that. He uses that kind of construction 11 times. 4 of them clearly start a new sentence, and this one would be the 5th if we take it that way. So John clearly doesn't mind having a clause like this begin a new sentence. And I actually think it makes more sense to translate it that way. What it would mean is that the end of verse 3 actually is the beginning of the sentence that carries on into verse 4. And it means that Jesus must continue to do his thing, to continue to do his works and to work his miracles before the night comes. And the night refers in the Gospel of John to his death and all that goes with it. And he must continue to do his work so that God's works can be displayed through this particular man. I think that makes pretty good sense. Either way works. And the main point is that Jesus has to continue doing his work to honor and glorify God before his death comes. And so he says in verse 4, we must carry out the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. And he means, as he goes on in verse 5, to say that his presence has brought God's light into the world. And while he's here, he must continue to do the works of God, including healing this blind man. That's why he says, night is coming when no one can work. When he says these words and he heals this man, at this point, it's only about 6 or 7 months from his crucifixion. And Jesus knows it's coming. He knows, therefore, that darkness, night is about to come. And these kinds of works that he's been doing in his ministry, they're going to cease to happen through him. He knows that's coming. And so he says in verse 5, while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And so while he has the opportunity, he needs to keep doing his thing and bringing God's light into the world. And so as a demonstration of that, being the light, he's going to bring light to this blind man's eyes. Here's how he does it. Look at verse 6. When he had said this, he spit on the ground and made some mud out of the saliva, and he applied it to this man's eyes. Kind of a unique approach to working a miracle, but this actually provides a very clear and tangible association between Jesus and the man's eyes. And it communicates that Jesus is working on the man's eyes. Remember, the man can't see. And so for both the man and the people watching, there is now a very tangible, physical, concrete connection between Jesus and this man's eyes. And after doing that, then, Jesus said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So Jesus sends him to the pool of sent. And this pool, the pool of Siloam, was a large and prominent pool in the city of Jerusalem. I'll actually put a map in the study hub with a location of it. And I'll put a link because there's a whole lot of archaeological work at the very moment of this recording being done in Jerusalem as to uncovering the full size and scope of this pool. The initial building of this pool actually happened 700 years before the time period of Jesus, in the days of the king Hezekiah. You can read about it in the Old Testament. Hezekiah had a tunnel carved into the city from the Gihon spring, which was outside of the city walls, and he had a tunnel carved through the limestone rock and into a pool inside the city walls because there was so much military activity and socio-political turmoil in his days that he knew if the city was ever under siege, they would not have a good water supply. So he wanted to make sure that there was now a water supply inside the city. And that's how he did it. It's actually a very fascinating story. And you can look up the Pool of Siloam, you can look up Hezekiah and the Gihon Spring, and you can find all sorts of interesting details about how this pool was formed and the tunnel was carved and all of that. I'll put a link, as I said, in the hub to a lot of the current work being done on this pool, huge pool. And so Jesus puts mud on this blind man's eyes and tells him to go wash off his eyes in the pool of Siloam. Now remember, this man is blind. We don't know exactly where he is when he encounters Jesus, but he's going to need likely some help getting to the pool. And depending on exactly where he's at, this pool is downhill, fairly good decline from the temple. So if they're up in the temple area, it's a pretty good decline down to this pool in the city of Jerusalem. But this man is not dissuaded. He's not discouraged by not an immediate healing. He obeys, and he leaves Jesus, and he heads down to this pool to wash his eyes. And so he left, and he washed, and he came back seeing. He comes out of the pool having washed his eyes, and now he can see. So, verse 8, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as the beggar were saying, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Others were saying, "This is he." Still others were saying, "No, but it looks like him." So they're trying to figure it out. Is this the guy that's the beggar? Because that beggar was clearly blind, and this guy's not blind. And some were like, "No, it's him." Someone's like, "Nah, just looks like him." And the man kept saying, "I'm he. I'm the one. I'm the guy it's me." And they were saying, "Well, then how were your eyes opened?" And the man answered and said, "Well, the man who is called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went away and I washed, and I received my sight." And so he describes what happened and how Jesus sent him away, and that tangible activity now, I think, provides really an objective, concrete moment for this man and for others to understand Jesus did this, and he did this in such a way that it was very obvious and clear. So they said to him, verse 12, "Where is he?" And the man who had been blind said, "I don't know." He's somewhere in the city, right? They don't know exactly where he's at. This man had wandered off down to the pool. Jesus had gone about his business. And so he's like, "I don't know exactly where he's at." So they brought the man who had been previously blind to the Pharisees. Now, we're not told their motivations for this. We know that the Pharisees, a lot of the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, are hostile to Jesus and want to do away with him. So we don't know why exactly they brought him to the Pharisees. We don't know exactly why he went. Were they sympathizers in opposition to Jesus, and that's why they took him to the Pharisees? It's possible, but then why would the man go with them? Were they hoping that maybe this man's healing might positively impact the Pharisees? Maybe so. We don't really know. But for whatever reason, this man goes with them to the Pharisees there in Jerusalem. And then John points out an issue with Jesus healing this man. Verse 14, John tells us, "Now, it was a Sabbath on that day that Jesus had made the mud and opened this man's eyes." It's just like John chapter 5 with the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. It's a Sabbath day. And that poses a problem, at least for some of the Pharisees there in Jerusalem. And so they come to the Pharisees, bring this man with them, and verse 15 tells us, then the Pharisees also were asking him again, "How did you receive your sight?" And he told them the story. "He applied mud to my eyes. I went to Siloam. I washed, and I see." Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, "This man's not from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath." Now, it's what's important to keep in mind is it's not the Sabbath per se that Jesus is violating. It's their understanding of how to keep the Sabbath. They've created this fence around the law and all these traditions that they believe will help a person legitimately obey the law. So they have all sorts of Sabbath traditions, and it's those traditions that healing this man goes against. And so they're saying he clearly can't be from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, that is, others of these Pharisees, others of the leadership were saying, how can a man who's a sinner perform such signs? And so now there's a debate, there's dissension among them. So, verse 17, they said again to the man who was blind, "What do you say about him since he opened your eyes?" And that man said, "He's a prophet." He clearly affirms that Jesus has some sort of prophetic ability and some sort of prophetic power. He's a prophet. But the leaders refused to believe that he was actually blind and healed. They're like, no, that can't be because he's violating the Sabbath. And so they refused to believe that this man had actually been blind and was healed. Look at verse 18. The Jews then didn't believe it about him, that he had been blind and he had received his sight, until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. So they don't believe it, so they send for this man's parents. His parents come, and they question them, saying, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he now see?" His parents answered the Pharisees and said, "We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. How he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." So in some regards, they kind of plead the fifth, right? They don't want to give a direct answer. Instead, they kind of say, you talk to him. He's old enough. He can talk for himself. And John explains why they do this, why they don't want to give a direct answer. Look at verse 22. His parents said this, John tells us, because they were afraid of the Jews. They were afraid of the Jewish leadership there in Jerusalem. Why were they afraid? Well, verse 22 goes on. For the Jews had already reached the decision that if anyone confessed Jesus to be the Messiah, he was to be excommunicated from the synagogue. He was to be kicked out of the synagogue. That's a massive deal for a Jew. That is a massive loss of community and support and honor and status, right? You've lost everything that your life was about. And they've already kind of spread the word that this is what's going to happen to anyone who confesses Jesus to be the Messiah. And so John tells us in verse 23, it was for this reason that his parents said, he's of age, ask him. They don't want to risk it. They don't want to deal with it. So for a second time, verse 24, they summoned the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. In other words, they want this man to agree that he's a sinner, and they want him to denounce Jesus. Now, we have to remember that at this point, they really have all the facts. They know that this man was born blind. They know that he now sees, and they know that Jesus is the one who did it. They have all the relevant facts, but they refuse to believe, and they pressure this man to change his assessment of Jesus. Not a prophet, but a sinner. How does the man reply? Well, he then answered and said, whether he is a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And this man confidently asserts the facts. Remember, he's standing before the Jewish leadership. They've already have let people know that anyone who confesses this man to be the Messiah is going to be excommunicated. And this man doesn't back down. He confidently asserts the facts. Though I was blind, now I see. So again, verse 26, they said to him, what did he do? How did he open your eyes? Now, they've already asked this. He's already explained this. They already know. This is just more evidence of their stubborn obstinacy. They refuse to believe, and so they tell us again. And he answered them in verse 27, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become one of his disciples too, do you? Notice that this man knows their game. He knows they don't need more information. The problem isn't info. It's stubbornness. It's obstinacy. It's hard-heartedness. And I actually love that he gets a little feisty, right? He gets a little sarcastic. You don't want to become his disciples too, do you? A little bit of feisty sarcasm to them. Verse 28, they spoke abusively to him and said, you are his disciple, but we're disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we don't even know where he's from. And once again, they refuse to acknowledge where Jesus is from. He's told them, he's talked with them, right? The whole last episode that we looked at, Jesus has emphasized that he's been sent from God, and he's finally just given up. They don't want to know. They don't want to believe. It doesn't matter how many times he gives evidence for it. Here, the evidence is clear. A person born blind has been healed by him. Still not going to be enough. Why? Because they don't want to believe. And so they say, we're disciples of Moses. We listen to Moses. We know that God spoke to him. We don't know anything about this man. Then this man goes on with a little bit more sarcasm to give the Jewish leaders a theological lesson. The man answered and said to them, well, Here is the amazing thing that you don't know where he's from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if someone is God-fearing and does God's will, well, then God listens to him. Since the beginning of time, it's never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Notice that. This man sees so clearly now. He doesn't just see physically, but he sees spiritually. And he gives this theological lesson with a little bit of sarcastic edge to the Jewish leaders. Like, we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if someone's God-fearing and does his will, God will listen to him. There's never been anything like this where a man born blind has been healed. And yet that's what happened to me. So how in the world is it that you can't know where this man is from? It has nothing to do with the evidence. It has everything to do with their stubbornness. They answered him after that little theological lesson. They answered him in verse 34 and said, "You were born entirely in sins, and yet you're teaching us?" And so that's their retort. They're going to make the same assumption as the disciples at the beginning. The fact that he was born blind means that somehow sin had infected him right from the get-go. And so they're going to use that against him and say, somehow you don't know anything because you're clearly born in sin because of how you were born. And so they put him out, which means they put him out of the synagogue. They kicked him out of the synagogue, made a public statement. He is now no longer a member of the Jewish synagogue, the Jewish community in good standing. Well, somehow word trickles back to Jesus that about what had happened and how he'd been brought to the Pharisees and how the end result was that he had been banished, kicked out of the synagogue, put out of the community. So, verse 35, Jesus heard that they had put him out. So Jesus goes and finds them. And up on finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Verse 36, he answered by saying, "Who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who's talking with you." Recall that Jesus had clearly affirmed his identity to the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. And now here once again to this man who was formerly blind, Jesus affirms as clear as day his identity. I'm the Son of Man. You've seen him. I'm the Son of Man who is talking to you. And the man who had formerly been blind said to him, "I believe, Lord." And he worshiped him. He acknowledged Jesus as the Son of Man and worshiped him. And then Jesus, in this moment, with the crowds gathered around him, makes a really important statement, not just about this man, but about the significance of this man's healing and what it means and who Jesus is. Look at verse 39. And Jesus said, "For judgment I came into the world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." What does he mean by that? Well, when he says, "For judgment I came into the world," what he means is, I came to like draw a line in the sand. That's the idea of judgment. I came to bring a great evaluation into the world and to sort out who really sees and who really doesn't see. Not just sees physically, but we're talking spiritual eyesight now. And the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, well, they claimed to see. They claimed to be in the know. They claimed to be the ones who knew God, knew Moses, knew God's ways. But their rejection of Jesus clearly indicates that they are blind. And people like this blind man who respond to Jesus in faith, they're the ones who now see clearly. That's the great judgment or the great evaluation that Jesus makes. It all now depends on a person's assessment of Jesus. Do you really want to see what life and God and the world is all about? Well, it depends on, do you see Jesus as who he really is or not? And this man sees. He believes that he really is the Son of Man, the one sent by God, God's anointed king, the one who's going to rule over all the nations as God's right-hand man, as Daniel chapter 7 had promised. He sees that, and he believes that, and therefore he genuinely sees more than physical sight, but spiritual sight. Well, those who are standing there when Jesus makes this statement in verse 39, those who are standing there from the Pharisees have a response or a question for Jesus. Look at verse 40. Those who were with him from the Pharisees heard these things and said, "We're not blind too, are we?" Like, wait a second, Jesus. Are you indicating that we're blind? And Jesus replies to them in verse 41, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But now that you maintain, now that you claim, we see your sin remains." In other words, if you acknowledged your spiritual blindness and you acknowledged that you didn't see, then you would actually be in a position where you could maybe see Jesus clearly. But because you're so insistent that you already know and you already see and you don't need to change the way you see things, now you can't see at all. And when he says, if you were blind, you would have no sin. Like if you were completely blind, there would be no accountability or responsibility for your assessment of Jesus. But because you claim to be the leaders, you claim to see, and you're leading people away from Jesus, your sin remains. So their belief in themselves and their belief in their abilities to see, that's what's actually keeping them from seeing. That is, from seeing who Jesus really is. If they would simply admit their blindness, then just maybe, they'd come to actually see. And so as we wrap up this story, let me just offer a brief reflection here. As this story reaches its culmination, John records Jesus' words to help us see the lesson we ought to learn from this story. And it's a lesson about blindness and sight. To truly see requires belief in Jesus. And the blind man, he sees. He sees clearly, not just physically, he sees spiritually, and he believes in Jesus. Even before Jesus found him and invited him to fully believe in who he actually was, this blind man courageously stood up to the Jewish leaders and stood by the facts of the case, and he pointed out that the leaders were ignoring the facts. Their unbelief, the Jewish leaders' unbelief, wasn't a matter of facts. It was a matter of the heart. It wasn't a facts issue. It was a heart issue. So, Jesus is the light of the world. He is the light of life, as this text says. And he can open our eyes and he can give us true, genuine light so that we can see who God is, who Jesus is, and what life really is all about. Jesus is the light of life. Will we believe? Or, in claiming to see, are we actually blind? All right, thanks for tuning into this session on the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. Thanks a ton for making this ministry possible. God is bearing good fruit all around the world through your generosity. And if you would you, just a couple of requests. One, would you, if possible, go and rate and review the listener's commentary on your podcast app if it has that ability? That in some way helps people discover more the podcast and helps more people find it. Would you share it on your social media channels via text and with all your friends? And also, if you've been blessed or impacted in some way by this ministry, would you consider prayerfully joining the team of supporters so that this ministry can continue to grow and increase and make a difference in more and more lives of people all around the world? Thanks a ton in advance for your support.